Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be sharing with you how to integrate your shadow using the concept of the sacred marriage. Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how you can integrate your shadow using the concept of the sacred marriage. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about the shadow and what shadow work is. So the shadow is basically the blind spot in the psyche, a place where we sort of relegate and go unconscious to repressed aspects of the personality so that we can forget about them. And shadow work is any process that we use to become aware of those aspects and to integrate those aspects back into our conscious personality. Now, a major facet of shadow work that pertains to our identity has to do with holding space for opposites within ourselves. So it's the ability to hold space for certain personality qualities that we have and their opposite. So for example, if I really strongly identify with goodness, for example, and then it's like I've pushed away badness, what I want to do is I want to recognize that I also have those other polarities within myself. Or if I really strongly identify with being a hardworking person, I also want to recognize that I have aspects of the opposite polarity. And within our ego structure, within our identity, we have many of these different polarities that we tend to polarize along. So good and bad, passive and aggressive, hardworking and lazy, strong and weak, etc. Now, in many ways, these polarities are actually false dichotomies, and I'll get into explaining that in a little bit. But what the sacred marriage is holding space for and integrating all aspects within our personality. So it's taking one thing and its opposite, holding space for it, and then allowing sort of those two parts to come together and to create something from that synthesis that is similar to, different from, and greater than the original two parent aspects. So for example, if we have aggression versus passivity, ultimately polarizations in either of those directions aren't going to be very good. So somebody who's aggressive all the time with no ability to be passive is going to be somebody who's really combative and maybe really up in people's faces all the time, and they can't pick their own battles. Whereas somebody who's on the more passive side of the polarity, it's like maybe they can pick their own battles, but they can't really stand up for themselves or for others, and maybe they kind of become sort of a doormat. And so the idea is, with the sacred marriage between passivity and aggression, you get something that resembles both of those parent aspects of passivity and aggression, but it's similar to, different from, and greater than either two, because both of those temper the negatives of the opposite and give birth to new possibilities and new potentials within us that weren't possible within that polarization. And when we have the sacred marriage and we have these two polarities coming together, the concept that arises from there is called the divine child, and that is that exalted expression of both of those aspects. Another symbol that relates to the divine child, or the idea of the sacred marriage, is the divine androgen. So this is seen in, let's say, mythical characters like Hermaphrodite, who was a mixture of both Hermes and Aphrodite. So bringing together both the opposites of the masculine and feminine to create something that is a synthesis between the two. And when we can hold space for the opposites within ourselves along any given spectrum of opposites, whether those are natural spectrums of opposites or just understood spectrums of opposites, we actually make more room within our identity and our worldview to integrate aspects of ourselves that might have otherwise been pushed away or repressed, thrown out like the baby with the bathwater. Now, just really quick, yesterday on April 5th, I did a live webinar called 3 Shadow Work Secrets to Get Out of Your Own Way and Reach Your Full Potential Without Having to Fight with Yourself. And if you would like to watch that, I'm having another showing of that live webinar on Saturday, April 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you would like to check out that live webinar, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box and you can register. And if you would like to watch it again, like if you watched it and showed up on the live webinar yesterday, you can also show up on the live webinar in a couple weeks from now. Now, if you're seeing this video past April 19th of 2025, I'm also going to have a link down below where you can watch the replay of the live webinar. All right, so let's get back into the video. So basically, I want to talk a little bit about polarizations, which I also call oppositional splits. And that's where we label off a particular trait or quality as good, and we see its opposite quality as bad or negative or undesirable in some way, and we try to identify strongly with the good polarity, and we push away the polarity that we perceive as negative. And when this happens, it prevents the sacred marriage from happening. So when we have a sacred marriage, it's sort of like we just allow that to happen, where we can oscillate between different elements of our personality depending on the situation, because we allow space for all expressions within ourselves that are of an exalted nature. But let me give you an example of what a polarization or oppositional split looks like in practice. So when I was 12 years old, I had some really, really strong opinions on like passivity and aggression. So when I was 12, I thought that passivity was an absolute good and that aggression was an absolute bad. And to me, the people that I looked up to, who I had an imperfect understanding of, I thought were like these like really, the idea of like pacifism and passivity kind of got mixed up together. And so I would look up to a lot of figures. Like, so one was my dad. My dad, he's like a really kind of, he is like a sort of a very like peaceful kind of guy. And, he was always like, oh, I never get mad at anybody. Like that was like his like point of pride, and that became my point of pride as well. And so like I basically started to, model my personality after my dad. But then I also started to look up to these other figures. Like I would look up to, sort of these like really shallow understandings of like the Buddha and Jesus, or, even like, let's say, figures like singers like John Lennon and like Bob Marley, or like I would even have like certain, kind of stereotypes like chilled out surfer guy, like all of those things were like, what I was like trying to identify with really, really strongly when I was like 12, 13 years old, because I saw this kind of chillness and this like passivity as like an absolute good. And, to me, it was like all about trying to build a superior identity. And I just thought that like, oh, somebody who's passive is going to be just a better person or superior in some way to somebody who's aggressive. And I had some really strong judgments toward people who were aggressive. And I especially had like strong judgments toward other girls who were aggressive, and so I think a lot of the, reaction came from like, let's say, kind of, maybe being bullied a little bit like by other girls who were kind of mean girls. And so it's like, oh, I never want to be anything like that. And so I kind of polarized myself, not only just in relation to passivity, but also kind of polarized myself over into the masculine. And so I would basically like hyper identify with like passivity to the exclusion of aggression. And there was also a dynamic there where it was like hyper identifying with masculinity, which I saw as very positive, and then disidentifying with femininity, which I saw as very negative. But thinking about like the polarity of passivity versus aggression, what that prevented me from were so many different things. So basically I became this total doormat, because I was just terrified that people would think that I was an aggressive person or that I meant harm in some way. And so basically I didn't have the ability to stand up for myself. I didn't have the ability to stand up for others. Basically, I was very like wishy-washy about a lot of things, because I wouldn't allow myself to incorporate healthy aggression into my personality. And as I've like grown up since then, and as I've gone through many different, sort of identity shifts and permutations, I have been able to integrate like healthy aggression more so. There's still a little bit of like resistance there. So that oppositional split, that polarization is not totally gone, but in incorporating more of an ability to connect with that part of myself, I'm able to express myself in much stronger ways, and I'm able to be more in touch with my boundaries and the things that I want and the things that I don't want. So it actually helps me anchor more down into my sense of personal sovereignty. And at the time when I was 12, I didn't know it, but I was leaving so much of my potential off of the table because I wouldn't even let myself admit to myself that I ever got angry. My whole idea was like, oh, I'm so chill, I never get angry ever, and I was really leaving out so much of my own power and my own personal sovereignty because I had pushed aggression away from myself. Now, someone could also have the exact opposite oppositional split, where they might see aggression as an absolute good and passivity as an absolute bad, where they say, okay, aggression means that you're strong and passivity means that you're weak and inert. And, while those are like the negative sides of like passivity, there's also important elements to passivity, like the ability to, pick your own battles, the ability to like be understanding and kind of see where people are coming from, so there's a lot of value there too. And if somebody polarizes themselves into aggression because they feel like aggression equals strength, then that person might have a tendency to use aggression even where aggression isn't called for. And that's one thing that's very important to understand about oppositional splits, is that when we are, let's say, kind of labeling out these aspects, even if one has like a positive connotation and the other has a negative connotation, there are different expressions of each one of these qualities that are either positive, negative, or neutral. So somebody who's looking well upon like passivity might think about it as peacefulness or pacifism or being chill, whereas they might think about aggression as like being mean, unkind, cruel. Or like somebody who's seeing aggression as like a positive thing, they might label it out with the words of like being strong, being assertive, whereas like, they might label out passivity as being weak and impotent. So oftentimes it's the words themselves that we use to describe these qualities that can create sort of this polarization where we say, oh, that one's definitely an unquestioned good and that one's definitely an unquestioned bad. Another example of this would be, let's say that somebody really hyper-identifies with being a hard worker. And, basically we would look at that as like a virtue, and it is. And then the opposite side of that would be laziness, which, in using that negative connotation word, laziness like is an expression, that is, going to hold us back and that creates a lot of problems. And so if we go like, okay, I need to integrate both being hardworking and lazy, it's like, well, why would I want to integrate laziness? Laziness is just an unquestioned bad. And we can use that with even things like good and bad. The ways that we label things out, the words that we use would influence us to believe that, there's nothing that's positive over here and there's nothing that's negative over there. But if we use more neutral words, let's say, to refer to hardworkingness and laziness, for example, like doing versus being, we can notice that if we go into opposition to laziness to such an extreme degree that we might actually get out of touch with the part of ourselves that can just be. Part of ourselves that doesn't have to feel like we're useful just to feel valid to exist. A part of ourselves that can actually relax and, sort of exist and kind of smell the roses and, just be able to be a human being without having to be like a human doing all of the time. And so even something that has like a negative connotation like laziness, underneath the umbrella of that word, you have a lot of both positive and negative expressions. Same thing with hardworking. There are both positive and negative expressions of that. So for example, like workaholism, or somebody who feels like they have to be constantly going and doing things just to validate their own existence. And so basically in any given polarity that we have, think about it as like these boxes have a certain word label to them. And oftentimes when we have a polarization, the word labels that we'll use will be really positive connotation for the, let's say, to the qualities that we identify strongly with, and we'll have really negative qualities associated with, let's say, the qualities that we really disidentify with. Basically, the boxes will be labeled with those positive and negative connotations, but inside the boxes themselves have both positive and negative qualities. So like I said, even like if those boxes are labeled as good and bad, and that's the word that's written on the outside of the box, what's inside of the good box has both good and bad in it, and what's in the bad box is labeled, basically has both good and bad in it. So when we have these polarizations, we're always throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're always saying, I'm like this, I'm not like that, and we're pushing away major facets of ourselves that are fundamentally neutral and can be expressed in both positive and negative ways. Now, when it comes to polarization, these can either be natural polarizations or just kind of understood polarizations. So with a natural polarity, you have things like up and down, big and small, and in terms of personality qualities, you have hardworking and lazy and good and bad, and you have all of these other things that we would just automatically understand as opposites. But even if there's something that's very context dependent and it's just kind of understood as opposites and it, isn't necessarily a natural polarity, we can still have polarizations along those lines. For example, when I was in high school, you could say that the way that I dressed was maybe kind of akin to kind of the goth style of things. And so I would go to like the thrift store and I would pick out all these different, sort of like, creative outfits, and I would make all kinds of interesting things. And then at the same time, when I was in high school, what became very popular around the time I was like 15 or so was like the emo style and emo music. And to me, I just was like really like anti that. I really didn't like it because it felt very commercial, and like there was like, I just like was very like resistant to it. And so I had a lot of like, oh, I don't want to be associated with that style. And so I kind of polarized myself over into what maybe, like I didn't even necessarily refer to it as goth, but maybe like polarized more over into my understanding of that to the exclusion of emo. Now, to somebody outside of that little subculture at that point in time in history, it would basically have looked maybe quite similar, in some ways, or, almost thought of as in the same genre, but within that context, that was really understood as like a polarization, a polarity. And so what I did is I polarized to one side, saw it as an absolute good, and pushed the other one away. And of course, in any kind of judgment that we have, we can always push parts of ourselves away, throwing parts of ourselves away like the baby with the bathwater. So along any given spectrum of natural or understood polarities, we can have these polarizations and oppositional splits. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to the sacred marriage and the sacred marriage allowing you to tap into these potentials that are symbolized by the divine child or the divine androgen is that it is a subtractive process and not an additive process. That means that you are going to take away whatever barriers you have to allowing whatever personality qualities you happen to have there, and you just allow them to be there. Instead of saying, oh, wait, let me get a perfect balance. Like I have this polarity and let's add that polarity to it. So it's not like an active process of like trying to create a perfect mixture of the two. For example, when I had that oppositional split around like pushing away aggression and the polarizing into passivity, basically it's not like I'm trying to like sort of integrate actively, aggression. What I want to do instead is I want to see what blocks and barriers that I have to aggression are, and in what ways I might be trying to protect or serve myself by pushing aggression away, and to start taking away those different barriers. So it's a subtractive process and not an additive process. And so with that in mind, here are the steps for letting go of your oppositional splits so that the sacred marriage can happen. So the first step in the process of letting go of your oppositional splits and enabling the sacred marriage is to write down any qualities or traits that you might judge in other people. So these are qualities that when you see another person have them, you have a really strong, visceral, negative reaction, or you have some kind of judgment come up. And on top of that, you also want to write their more positive opposite polarity there. So for example, if I strongly judge people who are loud or who talk a lot, I want to see also how I feel about people who don't talk a lot or who are quiet. Do I see really positive things in the person who doesn't talk a lot and who is quiet, or is it more neutral to me? And like, to what degree is my resistance to people who are loud and who talk a lot? The second thing I want to do is I want to look to qualities that I have a really strong attachment or admiration toward. So if I see another person that, let's say, possesses a quality and I really put them on a pedestal and I look up to them for that quality, or if I maybe even have a strong, let's say, identification with those positive qualities within myself, I want to write that down. And I also want to write down the more negative polarity that I might judge or have negative feelings about. So for example, when I was in high school, I had a really, really strong identification with being hardworking. And so I had a really, really strong disidentification with being lazy. And I had a lot of judgments along those lines. So you want to start with where are your strongest attachments and identifications? And you want to also see what are the negatives that are on the opposite side of that spectrum. Then I want to go through those lists and basically circle all of the negative ones from both of those lists And I want to go one by one down that list, and I want to ask myself the question, how would I feel if I saw myself as possessing that quality, or if other people saw me as possessing that quality? So for example, if I had laziness on that list or loudness on the list, it'd be like, oh, what if people saw me as lazy? Or what if I saw myself as lazy? Or if it's like, let's say I have a strong judgment toward people who are loud or who talk a lot, like, oh, what if other people saw me as somebody who was loud and who talked a lot? And how would I feel about myself if I saw myself that way? And when you're asking yourself this question relative to any given quality, you want to pay attention to your feeling state. If your feeling state is really, really strong, there's probably a really strong polarization or oppositional split that you can work on. If it's a more mild feeling, then that oppositional split might still be there, but not necessarily be the strongest. And you might not necessarily end up with repressed aspects around that. When you have a really strong oppositional split, you will tend to go unconscious to the parts of yourself that have that opposite quality. When you have a milder one, oftentimes it's more of just an active suppression, or there could be some mild like elements of repression as well. But basically, when you have a really strong feeling there's probably a lot to dig into that's going on underneath the surface of conscious, and probably a deeper seated reason for why you have that oppositional split in the first place. For example, when I was 12 years old, I was really convinced that I didn't feel anger at all, and if I would have seen my own anger and I would have like recognized that and saw that as like the same anger that other people have, it's like I would not have been able to tolerate that. Like I would have felt so much shame, and it would have totally undermined my identity at the time. So I really couldn't see that. So noticing where you have those really strong oppositional splits can be really helpful for noticing like the main, let's say, sensitive points or areas to explore into in your shadow work practice. Now, the fourth step in this process, and this is really important before we get to the fifth step. The fifth step has to do with basically finding the more positive expressions of those qualities. But you first want to go through this step, which is, can you accept yourself, and what process would you need to go through in order to accept yourself if you possessed this negative quality or that negative quality that's on your list? What would it take for you to be able to fully accept and love yourself, even if you were expressing those qualities in the worst way possible? For example, with my polarization against aggression, like if I were just the most aggressive person on the planet and I were constantly getting into fist fights with everybody and everybody saw me as this really mean, cruel person all the time, it's like, what process would I actually need to go through internally to fully love and accept myself if I were expressing in that most negative way? So you want to approach this, and this is like where it's really important with shadow work to have a sense of unconditional acceptance, that even if those qualities were expressing in the worst way, that you would still be able to be with yourself and be present with yourself and accept yourself. So that's very important. Then once you've gone through step 4 and you feel like you've fully gotten to a place of total acceptance of, let's say, the worst expressions of those qualities that you would have a tendency to push away from yourself and to judge in others, then you can go into thinking about, how can I express these qualities in the most exalted way possible? So, for example, if I've pushed away aggression, what are the most positive expressions of aggression? So is that assertiveness? Is that the ability to take a stand, to stand up for others? Is that the ability to be sensitive and to know what it is that I want, and to, step into my own power? There's so many different like exalted expressions of that. Or let's say I have that polarization against laziness. Let's say that I imagine myself being the laziest person on the planet, and I come to a point of acceptance where I feel no shame but total unconditional love and understanding to myself in that state. And then I can think, okay, well, what's actually the positive core of laziness? It's like the ability to feel valid just as I am, the ability to be, the ability to have grace and ease, the ability to not have to do tons of work, to work smarter in some kind of way. All right, so those are some steps that you can use to subtract the polarizations and barriers to the sacred marriage. Now, there are other angles through which to look at the sacred marriage as well. So there's like a strong archetypal masculine and feminine dynamic. Now, we'll probably explore those in later videos because I just wanted to go through this video in this case. But when it comes to these polarizations, the archetypal masculine and feminine qualities, when those come together, basically there's a lot of, let's say, connection to the unconscious mind and the Jungian concept of the anima and the animus. So we'll talk about that in later videos. But for now, that's all I have for you. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Go ahead, click the like button down below, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave me a comment down below. If you would like to watch the live webinar on April 19th, Saturday, April 19th at 1 p.m., go ahead, click the link down below in the description box. And also check out this next video if you want to learn more about shadow work. And until next time, keep becoming more you.